Rose Martinez had always been the type of person who blended into the background. At 45 years old, she had perfected the art of being invisible. Every night at exactly 11:30, she would push through the heavy glass doors of the Riverside Music Academy, her cleaning cart squeaking softly behind her. The security guard would barely look up from his newspaper to nod at her. After 3 years of working the night shift, she had become as much a part of the building as the marble floors she mopped. The academy was nothing like the places Rose had grown up around. Everything here screamed expensive. The walls were lined with photos of famous musicians who had once walked these halls. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and the practice rooms were filled with instruments that cost more than most people made in a year. Rose would sometimes stop and stare at the grand piano in the main hall, its black surface so shiny she could see her reflection in it. Her reflection always looked tired. Dark circles under brown eyes that had seen too much, gray streaks running through black hair that she kept pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her uniform was always clean but worn, just like everything else in her life. She lived in a small apartment across town, the kind of place where the heat didn't always work and the neighbors were too loud. But it was what she could afford, and more importantly, it allowed her to send money back home to her mother in Texas. Most people who saw Rose at work assumed this was all she had ever known. They figured she was just another cleaning lady who had never had much education or opportunity. They were wrong about almost everything. Rose had grown up in a tiny house in San Antonio where music filled every corner. Her father, David, had been the pianist at their local church for over 20 years. He wasn't famous or wealthy, but he could make that old upright piano sing in ways that brought tears to people's eyes. Rose remembered being 4 years old, standing on a wooden box so she could reach the keys while her father guided her small fingers across them. Music isn't about the notes on the page, Mija, he would tell her in his gentle voice. It's about the feeling in your heart that you share with the world. By the time Rose was 8, she could play better than most adults. Her father would beam with pride during Sunday services as she played hymns that seemed to float through the church like angels singing. Other kids her age were outside playing games, but Rose never minded spending hours at the piano. It felt like coming home every time she sat on that bench. Her father had big dreams for her. He saved every penny he could to pay for proper piano lessons with Mrs. Chen, an old woman who had once played professionally before moving to their neighborhood. Mrs. Chen was strict but kind, and she saw something special in Rose. This child has a gift, Mrs. Chen would tell Rose's parents after lessons. With the right training, she could play anywhere in the world. For years, it seemed like that future was possible. Rose won every local competition she entered. She played at school events, church gatherings, and community festivals. People would travel from other towns just to hear the young girl who could make the piano sound like magic. Her parents started saving money for her to attend a real music school after high school. Then everything changed when Rose turned 16. Her father had been complaining about being tired for weeks. Her mother kept telling him to go to the doctor, but he always said he was fine. He just needed to rest more. One Sunday morning, he collapsed right there at the piano bench during the opening hymn. Rose watched from the congregation as paramedics carried him out. She never saw him conscious again. The cancer had already spread too far by the time they found it. 3 months later, David Martinez was gone, taking with him all the music that had filled their little house. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Rose had ever heard. Without her father's income, everything fell apart quickly. The house payments became impossible. Her mother developed health problems from the stress and grief. Instead of applying to music schools, Rose found herself working at a grocery store to help pay bills. Instead of practicing piano, she was stocking shelves and counting every dollar. The old upright piano was one of the first things they had to sell. Rose remembered watching the buyers load it onto their truck. Her mother had cried, but Rose just stood there feeling numb. It felt like they were taking away the last piece of her father, the last connection to who she used to be. After that day, she never played piano again. There was no point. Music belonged to a life she could no longer afford to live. The years that followed were about survival, not dreams. Rose moved from job to job, always sending whatever money she could to help her mother pay for medications and doctor visits. She cleaned offices, worked in restaurants, did whatever she could find. Eventually, she ended up in the city, where the pay was better even though everything else was more expensive. That's how she found herself at the Riverside Music Academy. The night janitor position paid decent money and came with benefits. It was steady work, and steady was what Rose needed. She told herself it didn't matter that she was surrounded by music every night. She told herself it didn't hurt to hear students practicing during the day when she occasionally worked extra hours. But it did hurt. Every time she cleaned one of the practice rooms and saw sheet music left behind, her fingers would itch to touch the keys. Every time she dusted one of the pianos, she could almost feel her father standing behind her, guiding her hands. Sometimes, when she was sure no one was around, she would sit at one of the smaller pianos and just rest her hands on the keys without pressing them down. The students who attended the academy during the day lived in a different world. Rose would see them sometimes carrying expensive instrument cases and talking about concerts and competitions. They dressed in designer clothes and drove cars that cost more than Rose made in 5 years. Some of them were talented, but others seemed to be there because their parents could afford the tuition rather than because they truly loved music. None of them ever really noticed her. She was just part of the background, like the furniture or the paintings on the walls. They would walk past her as if she wasn't there, discussing their lesson plans and social events. It didn't bother Rose most of the time. She had learned long ago that being invisible was often easier than trying to explain herself to people who wouldn't understand anyway. But sometimes, late at night when she was alone in the building, Rose would allow herself to remember what it felt like to play. She would clean around the grand piano in the main hall and remember the weight of the keys under her fingers, the way music could fill up all the empty spaces inside her heart. She would remember her father's proud smile and Mrs. Chen's encouraging words about having a gift. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone young and hopeful who believed dreams could come true if you worked hard enough. Rose had learned that life was more complicated than that. Dreams were luxuries that people like her couldn't afford. The night of the spring gala was supposed to be like any other work night for Rose. She had been told to come in early to help set up, then work around the event until the guests left. The academy transformed completely for these fancy fundraising parties. White tablecloths covered elegant tables, flowers filled every corner, and servers in black uniforms carried trays of expensive food and wine. Rose had seen these events before, but tonight felt bigger, more important. The main hall was packed with people who had paid $500 each just to walk through the door. Women wore dresses that probably cost more than Rose's monthly rent. Men adjusted expensive watches and talked loudly about their businesses. These were the people who kept the academy running with their donations, and everyone knew it. Rose tried to stay out of the way as much as possible. She had specific instructions to clean only the areas where guests wouldn't be, and to be invisible when she had to move through the main spaces. She wore her usual cleaning uniform, but had made sure it was extra clean and pressed for the occasion. Not that anyone would really notice her anyway. The students who attended the academy were scattered throughout the crowd, some performing on small stages set up around the hall, others mingling with their families and the wealthy donors. Rose recognized several of them from her nighttime cleaning rounds. They looked different dressed up for the gala, more confident and polished than when she saw them practicing late into the evening. One group of students had claimed a corner near the main bar, laughing loudly and clearly enjoying themselves more than they should have been. Rose noticed them because their voices kept getting louder as the night went on. The leader of the group was a young man named Preston Wells, whose father owned several car dealerships across the state. Rose knew this because she had overheard other students talking about how Preston's family donated enough money each year to sponsor an entire scholarship. Preston was the type of student who seemed to believe the world owed him something. He dressed in expensive clothes, drove a sports car to school, and treated everyone around him like they were there for his entertainment. Rose had seen him be rude to other students who didn't meet his standards, and she had watched him throw tantrums when his piano teacher gave him constructive criticism. Tonight, Preston and his friends had clearly been sampling too much of the free wine. They were telling jokes that were too loud and laughing at things that weren't really funny. Rose could see some of the older donors glancing their way with disapproval, but no one wanted to say anything to children of such generous families. Rose was trying to quietly empty a trash can near their area when Preston suddenly noticed her. She had hoped to slip by unnoticed, but something about her movement caught his eye. Maybe it was because she was the only person in the room who wasn't dressed in formal wear. Or maybe he was just looking for someone new to focus his attention on. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying across the conversation of his friends. "Hey, cleaning lady." Rose pretended she hadn't heard him and kept working. She had learned over the years that the best way to deal with difficult people was to avoid eye contact and finish whatever she was doing as quickly as possible. But Preston wasn't the type to be ignored. "I'm talking to you," he said, walking closer to where she stood. His friends followed behind him, sensing entertainment. "Don't you know it's rude to ignore people?" Rose looked up briefly and gave a small nod, the kind of acknowledgement she had perfected for situations like this. "Sorry, sir. Just trying to finish my work." Preston's friends started laughing, not because anything was particularly funny, but because they could sense their leader was building up to something. One of them, a girl named Ashley whose mother was on the academy's board of directors, pulled out her phone and started recording. "This is a music school," Preston announced, speaking loudly enough that people at nearby tables started turning to look. "Everyone here is supposed to be musical, right? I bet even the cleaning staff must know something about music." Rose felt her stomach drop. She could see where this was going and every instinct told her to leave immediately. But she was still holding the trash can, and there were now at least 20 people watching the interaction. Moving away would only draw more attention. "I bet you've always wondered what it would be like to play for a real audience," Preston continued, gesturing toward the grand piano that sat at the center of the hall. "I mean, you're here every day surrounded by all this music. You must have picked up something, right?" The crowd around them was growing larger. Rose could see curiosity on some faces, amusement on others. A few people looked uncomfortable with Preston's behavior, but no one stepped in to stop what was happening. These were polite society people who didn't like to cause scenes even when they were witnessing one. "Oh, come on," Ashley chimed in, still holding her phone. "Don't be shy. I bet it would be fun. When else are you going to get a chance to play a piano like that?" Rose tried to step away, but Preston moved to block her path. "We're not trying to be mean," he said with fake kindness in his voice. "We just think it would be nice to give you a moment in the spotlight. Everyone deserves a chance to shine, right?" More phones came out. Rose could see at least 5 people now recording what they clearly expected to be an entertaining moment. She felt trapped, surrounded by well-dressed strangers who saw her as nothing more than a curiosity, a break in their evening's entertainment. "I really should get back to work," Rose said quietly, hoping her voice didn't shake as much as she felt it did. "Work can wait," Preston declared. "This is a party. Besides, I'm sure all these generous donors would love to see what kind of hidden talents we have right here in our own building." Someone in the crowd actually started clapping, encouraging the idea. Others joined in, and suddenly Rose found herself the center of attention for dozens of wealthy strangers who had no idea what they were asking of her. Preston's friends moved to either side of her, not quite forcing her toward the piano, but making it clear that refusing wasn't really an option. The crowd parted to create a path, and Rose could see that beautiful black grand piano, waiting at the end of it like some kind of judgment throne. "Just one song," Preston said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Something simple. We're not expecting a concert or anything." The laughter that followed made Rose's cheeks burn with embarrassment. These people thought they were being kind, giving the poor cleaning lady a chance to play with the big kids. They had no idea that every step toward that piano was taking her closer to a part of herself she had locked away 29 years ago. Rose's hands were shaking as she looked around the room one more time, hoping to find a way out, but every face was turned toward her expectantly. Every phone was ready to capture whatever happened next. She was trapped in a situation that felt like a nightmare, being pushed toward the one thing in the world that could break her heart all over again. The grand piano seemed to grow larger as she got closer to it, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier lights like a dark mirror. Rose could almost hear her father's voice echoing from somewhere deep in her memory, telling her that music was about sharing the feeling in your heart with the world. The problem was, Rose wasn't sure her heart could survive being opened up again. Rose stood in front of the grand piano, and for a moment time seemed to stop completely. The conversations around her faded into a distant buzz, and all she could hear was her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her hands hung at her sides, trembling slightly as she stared down at the keys that seemed to mock her, with their perfect black and white pattern. The crowd had formed a loose circle around her, about 50 people holding wine glasses and phones. all waiting for whatever was about to happen. She could feel their eyes on her like tiny spotlights, each gaze making her feel smaller and more exposed. Some faces showed curious smiles, others barely concealed smirks. A few people looked genuinely kind, as if they actually believed they were giving her a nice opportunity. Preston stood off to her right, arms crossed, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who had successfully created entertainment for himself and his friends. Ashley still held her phone up, already recording, probably planning to post whatever happened on social media within minutes. "Anytime you're ready," Preston called out helpfully. "Don't be nervous. We're all friends here." The bench looked impossibly intimidating as Rose approached it. She hadn't sat at a piano bench in almost 30 years. What if she had forgotten everything? What if her fingers no longer remembered how to move across the keys? What if she made a fool of herself in front of all these people who would then have proof of her failure, recorded on their phones? But something even worse occurred to her. What if she did remember? What if sitting at this piano brought back every painful memory she had spent decades trying to bury? What if touching these keys opened up all the grief and loss she had worked so hard to keep locked away? Rose lowered herself onto the bench with the careful movements of someone approaching something dangerous. The bench was the perfect height, adjusted precisely for comfortable playing. She could smell the polish that kept the piano's surface gleaming. And up close, she could see her own reflection in the black wood, distorted and wavering like a ghost. "Maybe something simple," suggested a woman from the crowd, "like Happy Birthday or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star." People laughed at the suggestion, not mean-spirited exactly, but the kind of laughter that comes when adults watch children try to do grown-up things. They expected nothing from her, which somehow made everything worse. Rose realized that part of her wanted to prove them wrong, wanted to show them that they had no idea who they were talking to. But a bigger part of her was terrified of what would happen if she tried. She placed her hands on her knees and tried to steady her breathing. The crowd was getting restless. Someone coughed. Someone else whispered something to their companion. Preston tapped his foot impatiently. "Take your time," he said in a voice that suggested his patience was running out. "We've got all night." Rose lifted her hands and held them over the keys without touching them. Her fingers felt stiff and uncertain, nothing like the confident hands that used to dance across piano keys as if they belonged there. She tried to remember the last song she had played, but the memory was too painful. It had been at her father's funeral, a simple hymn played on the old church piano while people filed past his casket. "I'm sorry," she whispered, starting to stand up. "I can't. I haven't played in so long." "Oh, come on," Preston said, and this time his voice had an edge to it. "Don't disappoint us now. Everyone's watching." The crowd murmured agreement. Someone called out, "Just try." Another person said, "You can do it." But Rose could hear the underlying tone. They were invested now in seeing something happen. They had gathered around and pulled out their phones and made this into a moment. If she walked away without playing, they would be disappointed, and their disappointment would turn into something uglier. Rose sat back down, her hands shaking more now. She pressed her palms against her knees and tried to think of something safe to play. Something simple that wouldn't hurt too much to remember. Maybe a basic scale, maybe a children's song like they had suggested. But when she finally placed her fingers on the keys, something unexpected happened. The piano felt warm under her touch, familiar in a way that made her breath catch in her throat. It was like greeting an old friend after decades apart, recognizing them instantly despite all the years between. She pressed down on middle C, just one note, soft and tentative. The sound filled the space around her, pure and clear in exactly the way she remembered piano notes should sound. Not tinny like the old upright at church, not harsh like the practice room pianos she cleaned every night. This was a piano that had been made to sing. The crowd quieted at that single note, perhaps surprised that she had actually produced a sound. Rose pressed another key, then another, picking out a simple melody that came to her without thought. It was something her father used to play when she was very small, before the formal lessons started, just a gentle tune to help her fall asleep on Sunday afternoons. As the melody developed, Rose felt something shifting inside her chest. Her hands began to remember what they were supposed to do. Her shoulders relaxed. Her breathing deepened. The crowd around her seemed to fade even further into the background as she focused on the connection between her fingers and the keys. The simple tune began to grow more complex without her consciously deciding to make it so. Her left hand found the bass notes that would support the melody. Her right hand added harmonies and small flourishes that made the song more interesting. It was still a quiet, gentle piece, nothing that would impress anyone, but it was clean and sweet and exactly what the piano seemed to want her to play. For the first time in 30 years, Rose felt like herself again. Not Rose the cleaning lady, not Rose the woman who had given up her dreams, but Rose who had once been called gifted. Rose who had made people cry with her playing. Rose who had planned to spend her life making music. But as that feeling grew stronger, so did the memories that came with it. She could almost hear her father's voice humming along with her playing. She could almost feel Mrs. Chen's hands guiding her fingers to the correct position. She could almost see the proud faces of people in their old church congregation when she played hymns that made the whole building feel holy. The pain of those memories hit her like a physical blow. Her playing faltered and she almost stopped entirely, but something in the piano itself seemed to encourage her to continue. The keys felt forgiving under her fingers, patient with her mistakes, ready to support whatever she wanted to create. Rose took a deep breath and made a decision that surprised even her. If she was going to do this, if she was going to let these people see her play, she wasn't going to play children's songs or simple melodies that would confirm their low expectations. She was going to play something real, something that mattered, something that would honor the music her father had taught her to love. She was going to play the way she used to play, back when music was the most important thing in her world, back when she believed it might be possible to touch people's hearts with nothing but 10 fingers and 88 keys. The crowd was still waiting, still watching, still recording. But Rose had stopped caring about them. She had found something she thought was lost forever, and she wasn't going to waste this moment by holding back. Rose closed her eyes and let her hands find their way to the opening notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. It was a piece her father had loved, one that Mrs. Chen had taught her when she was 15. She had played it at her last recital before everything changed, and now, 3 decades later, her fingers remembered every note as if she had played it yesterday. The first few measures floated through the room like a whisper. The melody was gentle and haunting, nothing like the simple children's songs the crowd had expected. Rose's left hand established a steady rhythm, while her right hand sang the main theme, each note clear and perfectly placed. The sound filled the concert hall with an intimacy that made conversation stop mid-sentence. People in the crowd began to look at each other with confusion. This wasn't what they had signed up for. The cleaning lady wasn't supposed to actually know how to play. She certainly wasn't supposed to play something this beautiful. Preston's confident smirk started to fade as he realized that something unexpected was happening. Ashley's phone continued recording, but her expression changed from amused anticipation to genuine surprise. Other phones came up as people realized they might be witnessing something worth capturing. Rose felt the music flowing through her like water that had been held back by a dam for too long. Her hands moved across the keys with increasing confidence, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought left off. The technical aspects of playing came back to her effortlessly. Her fingers curved properly, her wrists stayed relaxed. Her pedaling was smooth and precise. But it was more than just technique. Rose was pouring 30 years of suppressed emotion into every phrase. The joy she had felt playing with her father. The pride of those early recitals. The devastating loss when music disappeared from her life. The quiet sadness of all the years spent cleaning around pianos she could never touch. All of it flowed through the Chopin Nocturne like a river finally allowed to reach the sea. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Wine glasses stopped moving halfway to lips. Conversations died completely. Even the servers carrying trays through the room slowed their steps, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening at the piano. Rose transitioned seamlessly from the Nocturne into the opening movement of Mozart's Piano Sonata No. 11. The change caught everyone off guard. This was no longer a simple performance of one pretty piece. Rose was giving them a concert, moving from one masterwork to another with the ease of someone who had spent years living inside this music. The Mozart required different skills than the Chopin. Where the Nocturne had been flowing and romantic, the sonata was crisp and architectural, demanding precise articulation and crystal-clear voicing. Rose's hands danced across the keys with increasing speed and complexity, never missing a note, never losing the musical line that held everything together. Dr. Patricia Hartwell, the Academy's director, had been in her office reviewing donor files when she heard piano music coming from the main hall. She knew every student at the academy, knew their playing styles and capabilities, but this wasn't a sound she recognized. Curious, she walked toward the music and found herself standing at the edge of a crowd watching someone she had never seen before play her Steinway Grand. Piano. It took her a moment to realize that the person at the piano was wearing a cleaning uniform. It took her another moment to recognize Rose, the night janitor she occasionally saw when working late. And it took several more moments for her brain to process that the extraordinary music filling her concert hall was coming from someone she had barely noticed in 3 years. Rose moved into the most challenging section of the Mozart, a passage that required both hands to play rapid scales in contrary motion, while maintaining perfect balance between the voices. Her fingers flew across the keys with a precision that would have impressed the Academy's most advanced students. This wasn't someone who had learned to play simple songs. This was someone with years of serious training, someone who understood music at a level that couldn't be faked. The crowd was no longer just surprised. They were stunned into silence by what they were witnessing. Several people had tears in their eyes, moved by the beauty of Rose's playing and the obvious emotion behind it. Others simply stared in disbelief, trying to reconcile the quiet cleaning lady they had ignored with the artist now commanding their complete attention. Preston looked like he had been slapped. The prank he had orchestrated to embarrass someone he saw as beneath him had backfired spectacularly. Instead of creating a moment of humiliation, he had accidentally given Rose a stage to reveal talents that far exceeded anything he could do himself. His friends stood around him looking equally shocked and uncomfortable. Rose finished the Mozart and paused for just a moment, her hands resting on the keys as she decided what to play next. The silence in the room was so complete that people seemed afraid to breathe. Then she began the opening notes of Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. This was the piece that announced to everyone present that they weren't just watching someone who could play piano. They were watching someone who could play at a professional level, someone whose abilities rivaled those of the Academy's own teachers. The Rachmaninoff was dark and stormy, full of crashing chords and rapid passages that required tremendous strength and endurance. Rose attacked the keys with a power that surprised everyone, including herself. She had forgotten how good it felt to play forte, to let the piano sing at its full volume, to fill a space completely with sound. Her whole body was involved in the performance now. Her shoulders moved with the musical phrases. Her feet worked the pedals with precise timing. She leaned into the big chords and pulled back for the delicate passages, conducting the music with her entire being. Dr. Hartwell found herself analyzing Rose's technique with the critical eye of someone who had trained pianists for over 20 years. The hand position was perfect. The pedaling was sophisticated. The musical interpretation showed deep understanding of the composer's intentions. This was conservatory-level playing, possibly even beyond that. As Rose moved through the most challenging section of the Rachmaninoff, her face transformed completely. Gone was the tired, invisible cleaning lady who tried to blend into the background. In her place sat an artist lost in the joy of creation, someone for whom playing piano wasn't just a skill but a fundamental part of who they were. The piece built to its climactic moment, and Rose played it with such intensity that several people in the crowd actually stepped back from the power of the sound. Then she brought it down to the quiet ending, her touch becoming gentle and mysterious, leaving the final notes hanging in the air like a question that could never be answered. When she finally lifted her hands from the keys, the silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Rose sat perfectly still, her eyes still closed, as if she were afraid to return to the world outside the music. Around her, 50 people stood frozen in place, trying to process what they had just experienced. Then someone started clapping, and the spell was broken. The applause started with one person, then spread through the crowd like wildfire. But this wasn't the polite clapping that usually followed performances at Academy events. This was the kind of thunderous, sustained applause reserved for moments that truly move people. Some audience members were crying openly. Others stood with their mouths hanging open, still trying to process what they had just witnessed. Rose opened her eyes slowly, almost afraid to face the reality of what had just happened. The faces looking back at her were completely different from the ones that had surrounded her 15 minutes earlier. Instead of amused curiosity, she saw genuine awe. Instead of condescending smiles, she saw respect and admiration. She remained seated at the piano bench, her hands folded in her lap, unsure of what to do next. Part of her wanted to run. She had spent so many years hiding from this part of herself that being seen felt almost dangerous. But another part of her, a part that had been sleeping for 30 years, felt alive in a way she had forgotten was possible. Dr. Hartwell pushed through the crowd, her face showing a mixture of amazement and something that looked like shame. When she reached Rose, she extended her hand formally, as if meeting her for the first time. "I'm Patricia Hartwell, the director of this academy," she said, her voice carrying over the still clapping crowd. "And I owe you a tremendous apology." Rose shook the offered hand tentatively. "Ma'am, for 3 years I've had one of the most gifted pianists I've ever heard working in my building, and I never knew it," Dr. Hartwell said, loud enough for nearby people to hear. That was extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. The crowd finally began to quiet down as people leaned in to hear the conversation. Rose felt overwhelmed by all the attention, but she also felt something else she hadn't experienced in decades. She felt proud. For the first time since her father died, she felt proud of who she was and what she could do. Preston stood on the edge of the group, his face red with embarrassment and confusion. What had started as a cruel joke designed to humiliate someone he saw as beneath him had turned into something that made him look foolish instead. Several people were giving him dirty looks, clearly understanding that he had been the instigator of what could have been a very ugly situation. Ashley had stopped recording, but other people were still holding up their phones. Rose realized that videos of her performance were probably already being uploaded to social media. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it made her feel oddly hopeful. Maybe it was time for people to see who she really was. "Where did you study?" Dr. Hartwell asked. "Juilliard, Curtis? I need to know who taught you to play like that." Rose's voice was quiet when she answered. "I learned from my father, and from Mrs. Chen in San Antonio. I haven't had formal training since I was 16. The crowd murmured at this revelation. No formal training for almost 30 years, and yet she had just played pieces that challenged even graduate-level students. "Why aren't you performing professionally?" asked Mr. Robert Chen, one of the Academy's major donors. "With talent like that, you should be on concert stages, not cleaning them." Rose felt tears welling up in her eyes as she tried to explain. "Life doesn't always go the way you plan it. My father died when I was young, and music became too painful. I had to work, had to survive. There wasn't room for dreams anymore." The simplicity of her explanation seemed to hit people harder than a dramatic story would have. Here was someone who had sacrificed her extraordinary gifts to take care of her family, who had spent decades in jobs that were beneath her talents because life had left her no choice. Dr. Hartwell looked around at the crowd of wealthy donors and Academy supporters. "This is what real talent looks like," she announced. "This is why we exist as an institution, not just to teach people who can already afford the best, but to recognize and nurture gifts wherever we find them." She turned back to Rose. "I have a proposal for you. The Academy has scholarship programs for exceptional students. I want you to consider returning to school to finish your musical education. Full scholarship, everything paid for. You clearly have the talent, and it's never too late to reclaim what was taken from you." Rose stared at her in disbelief. "I'm 45 years old. I work nights so I can send money to my mother. I can't just—" "Yes, you can," interrupted Victoria Martinez, wife of a prominent businessman and one of the Academy's board members. "If money for your mother is the issue, we can arrange something. This is exactly the kind of situation our emergency fund was created for." Other voices joined in, people offering support, connections, opportunities. Rose realized that these weren't just empty promises made in the emotion of the moment. These people had the resources to actually change her life if they chose to. Preston finally found the courage to approach her. His cocky confidence was completely gone, replaced by what looked like genuine remorse. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I'm really sorry. I don't know what I thought. But I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Rose looked at him for a long moment. She could see that he was young and had probably never faced real consequences for his actions before, but she also saw something else in his face that gave her hope. He looked like someone who had learned something important about himself and didn't like what he had discovered. "Thank you," she said simply. Apology accepted. 3 months later, Rose sat in the same concert hall, but this time she was the featured performer. The spring scholarship benefit concert was sold out, with people coming from across the state to hear the cleaning lady pianist who had become famous after videos of her impromptu performance went viral. She wore an elegant, black dress provided by one of the Academy's supporters, and her hair was professionally styled. But the most important change wasn't in how she looked. It was in how she carried herself. She walked onto the stage with confidence, sat at the piano bench like she belonged there, and played with the joy of someone who had finally come home. Her mother sat in the front row, brought in from Texas by the Academy specifically for the concert. Tears streamed down the older woman's face as she watched her daughter reclaim the dreams that life had forced her to abandon. Dr. Hartwell had been right about Rose's abilities. Within weeks of starting her coursework, it became clear that she was operating at a level far beyond what most students achieved after years of study. Her teachers marveled at her musical maturity and the depth of emotion she brought to everything she played. Preston was also in the audience that night. He had become one of Rose's most dedicated supporters, using his family's connections to help promote her story and raise funds for other students who might have hidden talents. The experience had changed him in ways his expensive education never had. As Rose finished her final piece and stood to take her bow, the audience rose in another thunderous ovation. She smiled and waved, then looked toward the wings where her cleaning cart sat as a reminder of where this journey had started. Sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes a cruel prank becomes a doorway to redemption, and sometimes it's never too late to become who you were always meant to be.